Okay, thank you all for coming. My name is John Torpy. I'm director of the Ralf Bunche Institute here at the Graduate Center. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back our friend Ralf Fücks from Germany, from the Green Party, and more specifically at this point from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, which, as you may know, is the political education arm or foundation of the Green Party. All the parties in Germany have a political education foundation, and having once been a chair or co-chair of the party itself, he's now co-chair, president of the foundation. And somehow, in the midst of doing that, he's also managed to write, I think, a very stimulating book, which fortunately now has been translated into English. In English, the title, as you see, is Green Growth, Smart Growth, A New Approach to Economics, Innovation, and the Environment. We've had him here a couple times before, most recently to speak about the recent German elections, and he gave a fantastic talk about that was tremendously well received. So I'm very much, having also read the book, now very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say about it and to our discussion of it. And speaking of our discussion, we've drafted a colleague from the Ralf Bunche Institute, Tapio Kanninen, who's got a long history of work in the United Nations, but is now a co-director of our project on sustainable global governance. And he's going to offer a few remarks and sort of generate a lively debate after Ralf's remarks. So please join me on that note in welcoming Ralf Fücks to the Graduate Center. You're going to speak from here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's some water.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
So thank you very much, John, for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to have a hopefully lively conversation. For those of you who are more or less familiar with the history of green thinking, it may sound a little bit surprisingly that policies and environmental movement, from street protests to taking part in the Bremen state government, is writing a book on green growth, because the fundamental message of the global green movement, which still today is shaping the worldview of a lot of people committed to environmental concerns, was not only slightly different, but fundamentally different. Maybe you remember in 1972, the Bible of this new global environmental movement, the report of Dennis Meadows and his colleagues from the MIT to the Club of Rome. And the title of that really historical volume and its core message was limits to growth. So this way to think about the relationship between economy, society, and nature still today, I would say, is not if the dominant, but a very strong current in green thinking, that there is an inherent contradiction between economic growth and environmental protection, and that the only way to save the planet and to preserve the environmental preconditions for the human existence on this planet is to limit growth. And my book to a certain extent is challenging that narrative and trying to provide an alternative narrative, which I would like to lay out in the coming maybe half an hour. That there, of course, are environmental limits to growth. We have to be very careful about. But that these environmental limits to growth, or planetary boundaries to economic growth, don't define fixed limits for economic and social development of the human society on this planet. So the question is not so much about more or less production and consumption, but about a different kind of economy, and a different kind of relations between human activity and our natural environment. So, what are we talking about when we are thinking about economic growth and the planetary ecological system we are connected with? Until around about 1800, the vast part of human history on Earth was more or less stagnant. It was very, very low and very, very slow development in terms of technological innovation, inventions, productivity of labor, and also in terms of population growth. In 1800, around about 1 billion people have been living on the planet, and the overwhelming majority of them was depending from quite a primitive stage of agriculture with very low surplus. And then something almost miraculous happened, this kind of Big Bang. You can see in that graph an explosion of technological innovation, of GDP per capita, so economic output per capita, of consumption, which was all, of course, related to what we now call the Industrial Revolution. Based on the availability of energy in an unprecedented amount, so becoming access to fossil fuels, to coal and later oil as the main source and the main driver of industrialization. And based on the rapid evolvement of science and then innovation. So it's a completely new kind of development. It's knowledge-driven, it's science-based, and it was grounded in the availability of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels, this is nothing else than kind of stored solar energy over millions of years. Organic material was transformed into these fossil energies, and now there had been the technological ability to use these storage of high density energy for industrial purposes. And if you're looking to the green line, you can see that this kind of enormous economic boost of exponential growth went along with the growth of emissions of all kinds, which is just another expression for the consumption of natural capital. So economic growth, economic welfare was then achieved on the cost of our environmental capital, or the natural capital, the transforming of the landscapes, the disappearance of woodlands, an extremely extensive exploitation of natural resources of all kinds, and pollution of all sorts, air pollution, water contamination of soil. This was more or less the dominant type of development. And to be clear that the growth story will not end over the next decades, at least. We don't know if maybe in 50 or 100 years from now we will enter a new page of human history, but for the foreseeable future, the global economy will continue to grow. That's for sure. One of the drivers for global economic growth is the expansion of global trade in an even faster pace and a greater dimension than GDP itself. So globalization, interconnectivity, exchange, global investments are one of the major forces to keep on with global economic growth. There are other fundamental drivers. First, of course, the development of human population itself, from now 7 to probably 9 billion human beings until the midst of the century. Urbanization is a very important driver of economic growth. Now, for the first time, round about half of the world population is living in cities. And this process of urbanization will go on very powerful over the next decades. The United Nations are estimating that until 2050, 70 to 80% of global population will live in cities. And that would mean not 3.5, but 7 to 8 billion people living in cities. And this process of urbanization, of course, is linked with a huge amount of construction, housing, public infrastructure. So this is about material growth. It's not just post-material increase in GDP. And another very fundamental factor contributing to economic growth, of course, is research and development, technological innovation, and the pace of innovation is accelerating in an unprecedented manner. And economic growth is not so much about more of the same, it's about innovation, continuous process of inventing new technologies, new products, new kinds of services that will keep the economic machine going. So the economic growth up to now for the majority of societies, especially in the developing world, is deeply interconnected with social progress. Social progress and economic growth for them are only two sides of the same coin. And they I would say, rightly see economic growth as the main driver, the main the machine to move billions of people out of poverty into a modern lifestyle, a decent living standards, rising educational standards, better health care, longer life expectancy. Life expectancy since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has almost doubled. In around 1800, it was in Europe 36 years, and on average. Now, on a global scale, it's 73 years, and it's continuously going up. Only over the last decade, around about 700 million people have moved out of deep poverty into kind of modern lifestyle with electricity and sanitation, modern equipment, household devices, access to education, to professional healthcare, and all this kind of stuff. So there is no expectation for social progress without economic growth. Although, of course, growth is not the only answer to that. If you're looking to distributional conflicts, to the very unequal distribution of the benefits of growth, of course, policy matters a lot, investment in education and public health care. But basically, it's about economic growth. And it is no prophecy to predict that over the next 20 years, global GDP will simply double. So over the last 20 years, the global economy grew on average by 4% annually. Even if that will slow down, partly because China will no longer be this kind of steam engine for the global economy. If it goes down to 3%, we will see a doubling of global economic product within the next 18 years. But this story, even to a large extent, it is a story of human progress in a very comprehensive way. It comes with a dark side. The way we are growing our economy is inherently connected with environmental degradation in a large scale. And although the environmental quality in the highly industrialized countries, especially in Western Europe and the United States, improved a lot over the last 20 years, on a global scale, things are getting worse, and we are already on the move to transgress the ecological boundaries of the planet in a very concerning, if not to say in a threatening way. Climate change is only the probably most dramatic top of the iceberg. So global warming caused by increasing CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere, greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. But there are other areas which are becoming more and more critical, putting the global ecosystems at risk. The dramatic loss of fertile soil every year, which is decreasing diminishing the base for food security for a growing global population, loss of fertile soil because of contamination with heavy metals, or desertification. Another area of global environmental crisis is the overfishing of oceans, in line with the increasing acidification of oceans, also a result of growing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. This is extremely critical because it's endangering the biological life cycle in the maritime system. The extinction of species in an unprecedented dimension and speed, so loss of biodiversity. So, to be clear, this is a really dramatic picture that in the way we are increasing economic prosperity, at the same time we are decreasing the biochemical and biophysical preconditions of human civilization on Earth. And these preconditions are very fragile. They are not granted at all. The evolution of intelligent life in this universe is exempt, is not the norm, and it is depending from a very comprehensive and fragile set of natural conditions. So, if growth in the old way, business as usual, will lead us into heavy environmental, social, and political turmoil in the next decades, on the one hand, and no growth is no options on the other hand. What is the answer to that contradiction, or to that paradox? And the conclusion, and this is the main message of the book, and it's not just my personal idea. I'm leaning on a lot of environmental thinkers like Emory Levins, who published a book with some colleagues 20 years ago on natural capitalism, and other ones, is that we have to change the nature of our economy. We have to change the paradigm of growth itself. From growing on the expense of our natural environment to cooperation with nature, or to co-evolution with nature. This is the basic idea. And at the very core of that great transition into a different kind of economy is decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation. So this is the challenge we have to manage over the next 20 or 30 years, to enable economic growth and at the same time to reduce the human impact on our natural environment, on the ecosystem, to reduce our ecological footprint, to reduce emissions, to reduce resource consumption. So the old economic formula that if you want to increase output, you have to increase input, will no longer work. We now have to decouple input from output. And how to do that, it sounds a little bit like magic. There are three basic ways, or three main roads to that different kind of a green economy. First one efficiency revolution, making more out of less, creating more products and services, more economic wealth with less resource impact. I give you a simple example. There are hundreds and hundreds of others. If you replace conventional light bulbs by LED light, you are reducing electricity consumption by 80% without reducing comfort. It's not about sitting in the dark. And if you're looking to buildings or to our transport systems or electronic devices, there is huge space to improve resource efficiency. Just to give you a simple example, the per capita energy consumption in the United States is quite exactly double than in Germany. So every American citizen is consuming twice as much energy resources than a German citizen. And of course, living standard in America is not twice of that in Germany. It's not a difference in comfort, it's not a difference in our living standards, it's partly a difference in lifestyles, but mainly a difference in energy efficiency. Energy efficiency of buildings, of cars, also of the industry. The German industry is significantly more energy and resource efficient than United States, partly because of the, I would say, very low energy tariffs, especially in the central parts of the United States, which may be an economic advantage on short side, but on the medium and long term is undermining innovation, especially innovation in increasing resource efficiency. The second highway, or the second main path into a green economy is energy revolution. Getting rid of our dependency from fossil fuels, from coal and oil, and the medium and long term also from gas, moving towards a renewable energy future, which is not only about the technologies we already know quite well, so photovoltaics and concentrated solar power and wind and wave or tidal energies and geothermal energy. There are very promising projects going on to achieve to copy the basic process. The whole biological life on Earth is based on, in a technological way, photosynthetics. I'll come to that in a second. And the third main transformation is moving towards a circular economy, a zero waste or cradle-to-cradle economy in which every residual substance is being reprocessed, is returning either in the biological cycle, agriculture, or in the technological and industrial cycle. And in all these three areas, you already have very promising and a wide diversity of developments taking place. So I'm not talking science fiction, I'm talking about processes which already are on their way. And if we take this special case of decoupling economic growth from fossil fuel consumption and CO2 emissions, I'll just give you the numbers for Germany in the last years. In the last year, in 2014, we had a modest growth of GDP by 1.6%, which according to European standards is not so bad. Energy consumption went down by 4.7%. Electricity consumption by almost 4%, and energy-related CO2 emissions by 5%. So this is about absolute decoupling. And it is not just a single case, it is part of a longer story. If you look to the broader picture for the European Union over the last 24 years, since 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had a growth of GDP by 46%, and greenhouse gas emissions went down by 23%. These are the official numbers of the Environmental Agency of the European Union. And the rise of renewable energies, this move from fossil fuels to a post-fossil energy system is not limited to Germany and some other advanced, technologically, industrially advanced countries. It meanwhile has become a global boom. We see an exponential growth of renewable energies, especially of solar and wind, also beyond the OECD world, beyond the borders of the old industrial societies. In 2013, for the first time, investment in renewable energies outpaced investment in fossil fuels. So capital flows are being redirected from the old energy world into the new one. This gap between fossil fuels and clean energy will widen over the next years quite rapidly. And if you ask why, it's not just because of rising environmental concerns or the insight that we have to do something about climate change. No, it's it's about the economy. It's about cost. We saw a rapid, really impressive digression of cost for wind and solar energy over the last decade. Only for solar energy there had been a reduction of installation cost, of investment cost by almost 80% over the last 6 years. Similar for wind, down by 60%. So renewable energies are getting more and more economically competitive compared to new installations in coal-fired power plants or in gas or oil. And meanwhile, it's no longer Germany or the European Union or the United States which are leading this turnaround. Meanwhile, it's China. China alone in the last year had new installations for photovoltaics of 14 gigawatts. 14 gigawatts, that's equivalent to 14 huge nuclear power plants. China, meanwhile, is by far the biggest producer of solar modules and other technological components for solar energy. It is one of the major manufacturing countries also for wind. And now they are going to apply these technologies in large scale in their own country. They are not only using it for export purposes, partly because of the pressure of the environmental crisis in China has become so dramatic, especially air pollution, but also contamination of soil and of rivers, that protest is rising in the population, and especially the middle class in China is no longer willing to bear these environmental costs of economic growth without any respect to environmental or health issues. The next big thing in the energy sector probably will be technical photosynthesis, so transforming sunlight, CO2 and water into biochemical energies. There are hundreds of pilot projects meanwhile going on. Globally, we know very well how to do it in terms of understanding this process. Up to now, it is very energy intensive and very costly, so our research is focused on finding methods and develop catalytic ingredients which will make photosynthesis much more energy efficient and cost efficient. So if we succeed in that, finally, then energy will not be the limiting factor for economic development on the global scale. The same process which is going on in the electricity sector is now taking place, although in the transport sector, replacing fossil fuels by renewable energy, be it by battery or fuel cell technology, so using renewable electricity to drive our trains, to drive our cars, or developing biofuels in a much more sophisticated and more intelligent way than it was the case over the last decade. You made your experience in the United States with using crops to produce fuel, which is, if you take a little bit more sophisticated and comprehensive environmental account, not very reasonable, to replace then crops by organic waste, by cellulosis, or by microbes and algae as a source of then biofuels. Especially the aircraft industry is investing heavily in algae as the source of biokerosene. This is just to give you another example, a hydrogen, not train, but train, made in China. And hydrogen is a very interesting fuel because it can be produced with overshooting renewable electricity, and it can be used as a storage capacity for renewable energy, and it is available for, or it is able to cover a lot of purposes, driving cars or trains, or heating buildings, or being used for industrial purposes. This is another example for what is already going on. The re-engineering or redesign of a petrochemical refinery in southern Italy to a biorefinery, replacing oil from Libya, which is no longer available, by organic materials as the basic material to drive this petrochemical plant, and the main source for production in the future will be thistles. Thistles which are then growing in southern Italy without fertilizers and without technical or artificial irrigation, and other kind of organic waste from agriculture or from the food industry in southern Italy. So it is possible to substitute oil as the base, the resource base of the chemical industry by organic materials without competing with food security for a growing urban population. Another example for developments already going on is to bring back food production into the cities. Urban farming in a very sophisticated way, merging high-tech with organic farming in vertical greenhouses or in rooftop greenhouse farms producing food, fresh food for the cities 52 weeks a year, without long distance transport, without chemical pesticides, based on hydroponics. As far as I know, in Brooklyn there's a first large-scale example of that in New York, but there are a lot of other places also in Berlin where these kind of projects are now moving from their initial stages into commercial then scale. Regarding construction and reconstruction of buildings, this is an example from Hamburg, a fossil-free building. Energy supply is based on geothermal energy, photovoltaics, and what is the interesting and new element of that, using algae incorporated in these windows. They are growing in water in combination with the influx of sunlight, so it's about photosynthesis then again, and these algae can be used to produce biogas to heat and cool the building. So it's about an intelligent combination of different sources of alternative energies, and it's no miracle at all to construct buildings today in a way that they are producing more energy than they are consuming. Urban mobility, this originally is a German slide, as you can see. It's already today, it's a very outdated and old-fashioned idea that urban mobility has to be based on the private car. This is not the case in most of the cities than worldwide. Even in the United States, you see here the example of Boston. The numbers for Manhattan are much better. Even in the United States, individual car traffic is providing only a minor share of individual mobility in cities. There are very modern and advanced cities like Beijing with a very high rate of bicycling. 32% of all inner city traffic is done by bicycle. There are other ones which are very friendly to for walking. The outstanding example here is Paris, with 61 of all distances are done by walking. And this, of course, demands kind of integrated urban development with short distances between living, working, consuming, culture. So reintegrating the fundamental functions of a city, this is key to reduce urban mobility without reducing then comfort and without limiting the then options of living quality in a city. Public transport, of course, matters. We have cities with very modern, attractive and comprehensive public transport like Tokyo. Tokyo, one of the biggest cities, very dense, very highly populated. More than half of all transport is done by or provided by public transport. London, 41%, also a significant number. So this is not just a matter of individual habits or attitudes. Of course, it's also a question of public policy, of infrastructure, and then investments. And investment is the keyword for the next slide. Moving towards this kind of low carbon sustainable economy requires high investment to rebuild the public infrastructure, to rebuild our cities, to redesign the industries, to renew the energy systems. And of course, in economic terms, higher investment rates today are the source of economic growth and jobs and revenues of them tomorrow. So the idea is to kickstart a new cycle of green growth by this combination of higher public and private investment and ongoing innovation. All of the big growth cycles in the history of the modern industry have been based on innovation. Starting with the steam machine, introducing electricity, the upcoming of the chemical industry, then after World War II, the car industry with individual mobility, and of course the last big bang, the digital revolution, which created a completely new set not only of products, but also changed our cultural life a lot. And I'm convinced that this kind of big bang is just emerging under our eyes, related to this whole range of environmental innovation. So this is not only about investment in technology and in material infrastructure. This is also about investing in people, in economic terms, investing in human capital, education, vocational training, public health care. These are empirically the most important factors to include people in the in modern knowledge-based economies, and to offer them opportunities to become part of that story. There is another aspect or another dimension which is not so much about innovation in technological terms, but about ethics, about values. If you're looking to modern societies in Western Europe, but also partly in the United States, you can see the emergence of a more value-based economy, which is not only and not primarily about short-term profit, but combining and balancing ethical values with economic progress. For instance, the whole fair trade economy, offering producers a fair economic share, looking for the environmental account of the products, be it cell phones or be it t-shirts, introducing social environmental standards along the value chain of the companies, introducing sustainability certificates, for instance, for sustainable wood or paper or clothes, and of course changing individual habits, lifestyles in terms of mobility, of our diet customs, reducing meat consumption, and the whole idea that prosperity and a good life is not just about the accumulation of things. It is much more about available time, richness of social relations, about education and culture. So another idea of a good life. So all these factors are interfering with each other and reinforcing each other. And if you're looking to the main agents of change, who will be the drivers of that big transition, first, we are convinced that policy plays a key role. Policy matters a lot, starting with the governance of the global commons, like the oceans or the atmosphere, the environmental heritage of mankind, which needs a better kind of governance to protect them from overuse, setting environmental standards, for instance, efficiency standards for buildings, for vehicles, or for electronic devices, introducing a cap and trade regime on a transnational scale, putting a price on carbon. In a market economy, price signals matter, and the externalization of environmental cost is one of the main sources for the ecological crisis we are facing today. and public procurement, introducing sustainability standards in public procurement is another quite significant instrument to redirect also the production or the supply side of the economy. Civil society as the second major agent, change agent, the world of NGOs putting pressure on businesses and governments, rising public awareness, consumer power, so responsible or sustainable consumption in a market economy is quite significant, changing lifestyles, bottom-up innovation like car sharing, this is a social invention. The third major player, businesses. A large part of innovation is taking place within companies. 70 to 80% of all innovation, technological innovation, is not in the public sector, it's in the private sector. So we have to use the know-how of companies and directing it in a more sustainable direction, fostering entrepreneurship, startup culture, and last not least, science, research and development, especially the upcoming merger between biotechnology, nanotech, information technology, and these kind of green innovations I've been talking about. And finally, a joke. So the whole story of green innovation and green economy is not just to prevent catastrophic climate change and other threats to human civilization on Earth. It's about to improve the living of billions of people on that planet, to provide clean water, clean air, livable cities, to improve health conditions, especially for children who are the most vulnerable human beings, and to preserve a natural environment we can correspond with, to have kind of productive dialogue between human society and nature. So we have several gains or kind of added value in that kind of transformation I was talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ralf. That's lots of food for thought. But first we're going to have some comments by our very own Tapio Kanninen, who hopefully will join us now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please, that way.
You two,
maybe
why don't you
a little bit
just-
easier.
or-
Okay.
You're not using PowerPoint, right?
No, I'm just putting my... Thanks a lot. I had the opportunity to glance over the book before, and I highly recommend it. I have no problems of its major thesis, decoupling thesis, and green growth and smart growth thesis. I take issue of some things which are advocated in the book, and I come to that in a moment. But since I have been in a long time in this field, early 1970s, on and off, I'm also looking what is new in the book. And what was interesting for me was that the great German philosopher and author Goethe was, in your view, Ralf, already giving warnings about these things, and his masterpiece Faust also could be interpreted in this way.
Yeah.
But now I take issue with two questions which you were advocating. Ralf, although you were positive about the limits to growth, and which was report of the Club of Rome, you still did not like the doom and gloom projections, which were already there, and then Dennis Meadows, one of the the main author of the report, still has that kind of philosophy. In fact, I shared quite great deal to Dennis' philosophy myself. Already in 1972, I did my master's thesis in economics on the limits to growth, and now I'm a member of the Club of Rome. And I really think that we need sometimes to scare us to death for actions. And we are indeed in a great danger for the whole humanity, because there are so many tipping points which can lead us to a runaway climate change. And another German, Hans-Joachim Schnellhuber, from Potsdam Institute, is saying that if we go as we go right now, towards the 4 degrees increase Celsius increase climate compared to pre-industrial times, the carrying capacity of the planet is under 1 billion, and now we are 7 billion. So where are these 6 billions vanishing in 1 century or a couple of centuries, if you don't change things? So it is a little bit like doctor is telling you that you have an unhealthy living style, but only when the doctor is telling you that you have a precancerous cells in throat or something, then you might change your living. So I think we need doom and gloom scenarios from time to time. The other thing is that Ralf is referring to another author of Limits to Growth, Norwegian Professor Jørgen Randers, that he doesn't believe in democracy, that the democracy is able to take us from this dilemma, and he is advocating autocratic model like in China. It's going to be more efficient. But I really think that democracy has a problem here. And we just look into these, what is happening in different parliaments, not the least in the United States at the time. And that's the short electoral cycles which are determining the political decision making. The re-election is determining everything, and that means the short-termness, not national interest or not national egoism is prominent, and this is well in show in present climate change negotiations. We just finished the Bonn negotiations. The co-chairs had produced of a working group which is producing this text for Paris negotiations. They reduced from 90 pages something more manageable, like a 15 pages text. But now in Bonn, everybody was coming with their own pet projects, and that's coming from national governments and their politicians. They don't want to give in. Everybody wants just their national interests, and it's now a much longer text again, which might be unnegotiable. So that's like politics, which is very much what is happening in the democracy. But I'm advocating myself, it's a new model, which is bypassing the negative side of the democracy, and we should be relying more both on the long-term interest of corporations and the long-term interest of citizens. And corporations understand that they cannot do business in the 4 Celsius increase climate, which is too hot for everyone, and we are heading for that. And the Club of Rome was really based on corporate interest. Fiat, Olivat, Volkswagen, we are behind it. And it's interesting what Volkswagen is doing right now. And we have tried in Finland, where I'm coming from, something different. The biggest corporations, some 70% of our GDP, have just organized themselves to create a climate leadership council. And they're asking politicians to show long-term leadership, not just this political cycle leadership. And we are getting some results. The politicians really listen to corporations if they're really powerful, because that they really run the world in a way, in many things. So we need enlightened corporate leadership, which might be important. Another thing is the grassroots support for change, and not just asking people to change, others people to change, but you change yourself. You show the model, and that's why we created in Finland so-called Citizens Climate Pledge, where everybody commits to reduce carbon footprints by 50% in 10 years. And we got the labor movement, we got the church, we got the politicians together, and now UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention, is also with us. So we need both top-level pressure and grassroots pressure, and maybe we can get out of the cradle of democracy dilemma in that way.
Thank you very much. Should I respond? Thank you very much for these comments and remarks, which are just hitting the nerve, or very important nerve, of the whole theoretical and political system we're talking about. First, thank you for your remarks regarding Goethe, who interestingly was not the only one who in very early, even embryonic stages of the upcoming Industrial Revolution anticipated its destructive power. Almost at the same time when Goethe published its Faust II, his main oeuvre, in which he's criticizing or pointing at some elements of industrial capitalism, which until today are very much disputed. Acceleration is one part of the story. So the growing pace of everything, not only technological innovation, but everyday life, and for him this was something diabolic, this acceleration of pace. A second element, which is part of Faust, is this kind of very this exploitation of natural resources, trying to gain the upper hand over nature, which in Goethe's perception inevitably would lead into disaster. So the nature would hit back and would finally triumph over the human's ambitions. He was very sensitive towards all kinds of human hubris, trying to not only being a creature, but to create our natural environment, and finally to recreate ourselves as human beings. So he had a lot of elements which still today are part of the story, but I would say he was very, very extremely anticipating and forward-looking in terms of the destructive potential of modern industrial capitalism, but he didn't see the potential for progress in it. Improving the lives of billions of people on the planet. And this is just the problem of what you correctly named the doom and gloom philosophy or worldview of Dennis Meadows, a large part of the environmental school. You are right that we have to be clear and we have to be loud in terms of the threats and dangers of the current growth model. But now for over 30 years, for more than 30 years, we learned that it's not enough to scare people. Maybe it's even the other way around. If you scare them too much, you create a kind of cynicism or of kind of Titanic mentality. So let's have party and enjoy the final days of mankind. So we need at the same time, and I would say even more than this kind of apocalyptic worldview, we need a promising and encouraging narrative. People only will start to change, and politicians will only start to change substantially if there's not only the need for change, but also the availability of alternatives. So we need this kind of an alternative narrative, and this is, of course, in the core of this idea of green growth or another kind of progress, economic progress on Earth in line with the planetary boundaries. And I would say it's not so much about changing our lifestyles. Of course, this has to be part of the story. I tip to some issues like our diet customs, the overconsumption of meat, or individual mobility, no longer based on the private car. But I don't believe a second that the solution to the environmental challenges will lie in kind of personal restriction. Giving the enormous growth of the global economy, the rise of billions of people from poverty to modern lifestyles, the key to deal with climate change and other environmental threats is a deep change in our economies, in our technologies, in our public infrastructure, and in the relationship between society and nature. So if we are serious in reducing CO2 emissions of the highly industrial world by 90% until the midst of the century, it's clear that that will not happen by reduced consumption. by bringing down consumption, and that's just out of. And it's also not. It's also not a. I would say it's not only not realistic. It's not the way I would like to see the future. And this again is related with the democracy issue. Now, as long as we just preach people, or as we are preaching people, you have to sacrifice now to save the planet tomorrow. It will be very difficult to convince majority of our society to follow that path. So I think it's not primarily about sacrifice. It's about doing it different and better. Starting with food. So a more vegetarian-based diet is not about less joy of eating. It's not about less delight. It's about doing it different and more smartly and more healthy. Similar with mobility. It's not about restricting ourselves to a circle of 30 kilometers or miles around our birthplace, which has been the case for our ancestors, but reinventing mobility in a sustainable way. Similar with energy, we don't have to freeze to have a CO2 neutral energy system for our buildings. We can do it with renewable energies and high efficiency buildings. So I think we have to tell another story to overcome this gap between short-term and long-term you have been rightly touching upon. And I agree very much that, and this was part of my Agent of Change story, that companies, forward-looking, long-side companies and civil society, public citizens have to play an important role to convince politicians and parties to change course. But fundamentally, and this is part of my argument against Randers and his sympathy for authoritarian governance systems. Fundamentally, I'm not only deeply convinced that freedom and democracy are values in itself, which are not negotiable, also not in exchange for environmental purposes, but at least democracies are, on the long run, much more innovative, much more creative. They can provide this kind of trial and error learning systems we need to deal with these environmental challenges. And they are enabling diversity, also diversity solutions, which is much better than a kind of command and control system than top-down.
So, we're a little short on time, but shall we take a question or two from the audience? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you both. I read an op-ed piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago that suggested that the best way for the United States to approach global warming would be as a sort of war economy. as a war economy, right? So that it's not
Yeah.
not an authoritative state, but that we can take actions to take over certain industries and because I think in this country, in Germany, the situation is different, and the general attitude toward the environment is different, certainly. But in the United States, where more than half of our energy comes from coal, or half of electricity is produced from coal, people are voluntarily going to change their habits. And I think so that I like this idea of a war economy. And I think another possibility, and I'd be interested in your position on this, because I do think that disincentivization is part of it. I don't think it's either that or green growth. I think you can also disincentivize certain practices, but like maybe how something like the basic income guarantee, the Grundeinkommen, right, would be a way of disincentivizing growth, like with a domestic.
Yeah. Okay.
I know the Green Party is
To start with the latter, I think there's some contradiction in itself. If you are advocating at the same time, I would say a significant basic income of, let's say, $1,000 or $1,200 per individual a month, and a non-growth economy. I beg you, these are you can't have both at the same time. Because this would require such a huge amount of redistribution of wealth. You can't do that alone with redistribution of taxes. Otherwise, you would run into sharp economic decline that would undermine the economic base for a basic income. So people who are advocating a high basic income without any obligations, they intentionally or not, will depend from a highly productive, highly innovative economic sector. Otherwise, you would enter this kind of down spiral circle economically. I'm not so sure if I understood your point, or if I got your point with the war economy right. I would say if we don't manage to keep climate change within manageable limits, so within the range of maybe 2 degrees then globally, and we will hit, as you already pointed out, tipping points which will lead us into self-enforcing runaway climate change. We will end in that kind of war economy, kind of control and command, then economy with very strong regulation of production, very strong regulation of consumption, maybe even more militarization in terms of resource than conflicts. But this is not the future I would like to envision, to advocate. We are talking about a very both complex, diverse and sophisticated transition, and this will not successfully happen just from top down. We need to set free creativity, ingenuity, initiative, civil initiative, entrepreneurship on a large scale. And this will only happen, I would say, in a liberal environment with kind of strong guidelines for the market economy and also this kind of civil diversity. So for me, it's not an contradicting, but an complementary approach that we both need a strong regulatory state, which is then defining the framework for a very vivid market economy. So markets are depending from then quite then comprehensive then preconditions they cannot produce themselves, and a part of that framework is that prices should reflect true costs. This is a political task to look for prices that are really reflecting the long-term cost of be it fossil fuels or car mobility, whatever. So there's a role for the state, there's a role for public policy, but I would not like to enter a path which will lead us finally to a kind of central planning, which is much too undercomplex. And to touch briefly your question about decentralization, it's, I think, especially if you look to the energy sector, renewable energies are a very different approach to than energy supply, much more decentralized, with a much bigger role for citizens, not only as consumers but as producers of energy. In Germany alone, we meanwhile have more than 1 million people involved as investors in solar and wind energy. So this is a citizens' economy, decentralized citizens economy, but again it needs a kind of public policy framework. So in terms of regulation of the grids and of a smart coordination of decentralized energy production and backup capacities, you need to balance these fluctuating renewable energy sources. So it's about a mix of decentralization and federal policies, or in the European case, I would even say transnational policies we need.
We're already a little over time, but take one more question.
Now, I definitely agree with you that alarmism, which is actually what most climate warning does, is not a good thing, because not necessarily because we're going to go into a Titanic type of mode, but also because people, when they face the fear of scarcity, they tend to be more aggressive. They tend to be more to stash more, to stash more, to be more.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I don't think that this is a correct attitude and a correct approach. Let alone that the physics of climate is not yet determined scientifically. And I follow scientists from either side, and they both agree that the models are not yet robust, but they each try to advocate for their own set of assumptions. So, and that goes in with democracy versus autocracy. The problem with autocratic regimes and command economy is that most of the time, the dictator or the ruler or the elites do not have all the facts, and they don't have the common sense, so they end up violating common sense. That's the problem with autocratic regimes. At least democracies have the shield, the defense mechanism to filter policies and methods and practices through a more strenuous dialectic cycle. The last point I want to make is that you also keep emphasizing the economic value, let's say, of the environmental commons, but that's not actually where the money is being made. So you are talking about incentives on marginal lands, and you don't mention incentives on urban centers, where this is where the money is made. The money is not made in the Arctic Circle. The money is made from the people that consume in the urban centers. And these perverse like economic incentives, I haven't heard anybody saying why not address these first, and then that will solve the problem of abuse of the commons and abuse of resources.
That's a
loaded question.
That's an interesting invitation to another seminar. But maybe some brief comments. Starting with the validity of climate science and the climate models. I think nobody who is scientifically serious would reclaim that the climate models are perfectly rebuilding the complexity of the global climate system, but then over the years they evolved in a way that I would say at least give us enough security to make a decision that according to precautionary principle, we should not experiment with climate change until it is happening in an dimension that we will not be able to pull back and to control. So and again, if more than 90% of the scientific community are advocating that we have to break up the cycle between greenhouse gases and global warming, I would recommend to take that very serious and not to take a wait and see approach. And this even more, this was my last slide, that the changes and transformations we are talking about are not just about preventing climate change. This is a much broader and more comprehensive story. It's about, as I said, it's about fertile soil, it's about clean water, it's about clean air. If you're looking to cities, it's about a smarter, a more intelligent mobility system, which will not lead to overwhelming kind of car traffic our cities are suffering from. So there are a lot of motivations and a lot of added value if we are going towards let's say not only low carbon but an environmentally sustainable mode of production and then consumption. And concerning the then global commons. I think the awareness, the consciousness is rising that the old model of using the atmosphere or the oceans just as a kind of waste dump for increasing production and consumption will fire back. And this is not only a moral argument that we are responsible for the options for the future generations and leave them a livable environment. This has become, let's say, a matter of our current problems, or the way we are dealing with the now and here and now problem. And there are some experiences with kind of global governance for these commons. If you think about the Montreal Protocol, protecting the ozone layer, or if you are thinking about the Antarctic regime, protecting the Antarctic from economic exploitation, and I would then advocate that we make use of this growing sense that we are living in a very interdependent world, to then advocate more of this kind of global governments. And again, the issue will be how could we move from short-term economic exploitation of the global commons to long-term sustainable government of these heritage of mankind. But finally, this is another example that we have to find a balance between restriction, also restricting the use of very vulnerable ecosystems like the Arctic from economic exploitation, and opportunities. We will not be successful in restricting the access to these resources if we cannot show and if we cannot demonstrate that there are viable and feasible alternatives for further economic and human development, that we will not depend from using the last drop of oil and the last pound of minerals embedded in these areas to provide a better future for billions of people than on Earth. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we've gone a little bit over time, but so I want to wind things down. As I thought about this continuing debate between sort of fear and hope as the basic modes, when we think about what's happening with the climate, I was reminded of Antonio Gramsci's line about, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will it seems to me in a way, it's the reverse here. I mean, your position above all, I think, is a kind of optimism of the intellect and perhaps a certain skepticism of the will and a reliance on markets, really, basically on open societies as the only real institutional foundation for mastering this problem. Tapio was a little skeptical about, whether the democratic version of those societies is actually in a position for its own kind of institutional reasons for getting getting a handle on this problem. But in any case, there is a kind of optimistic position in the book and in your remarks that I find inspiring, and I hope you're right. I guess is what it comes down to. But thank you all for coming, and let us thank Ralf Fücks for another terrific presentation.